Hello, guys. Welcome back to Hold On Survival Stories. I'm your host, and how are you all doing today? I hope you're having an amazing day, and you're ready for another absolutely incredible survival story, because today's episode is going to blow your mind in ways you can't even imagine. Before we dive in, I want to give a huge shout out to everyone who's been liking, commenting, and subscribing to our channel. Your support means everything to me and helps us bring you these incredible real-life survival stories every single week. And for those of you who are new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because trust me, you don't want to miss any of these amazing stories. Now, today, we're heading into the wilderness for a story that will show you just how quickly a dream hiking trip can become a race against death itself. This story will demonstrate how medical knowledge and wilderness survival skills can mean the difference between life and death. How the human body can push beyond its limits when survival depends on it. And how sometimes your own body becomes both your greatest enemy and your most determined ally. You'll witness how 48 hours without life-saving medication can turn a beautiful mountain adventure into a desperate fight against time. And how the determination to see loved ones again can literally keep your heart beating when your body wants to shut down. This is the story of 29-year-old Dr. Sarah Chen, a type 1 diabetic and emergency room physician who became stranded in the Rocky Mountain wilderness when her insulin supply was destroyed, and how her medical knowledge and unbreakable will to survive turned a potential death sentence into an incredible journey of human endurance. By the end of this story, you'll understand why preparation, medical knowledge, and never accepting defeat can overcome even when your own body is working against you. So, grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and let's dive into this absolutely mind-blowing tale of survival against impossible medical odds. Thursday morning, August 17th, 2023, dawned crisp and clear in the Colorado Rockies with the kind of perfect mountain weather that made Dr. Sarah Chen's heart sing with anticipation. The 29-year-old emergency room physician at Denver General Hospital had been planning this 5-day solo backpacking trip for months, and everything seemed to be aligning perfectly for what she hoped would be the adventure of a lifetime. Sarah had been living with type 1 diabetes since she was 12 years old, and over the past 17 years, she had refused to let her condition limit her dreams or adventures. As an ER doctor, she understood her disease better than most patients ever could, and she had developed meticulous systems for managing her diabetes during outdoor adventures. She had completed dozens of challenging hikes, including summiting 3 14,000-foot peaks in Colorado, always with careful planning and backup medical supplies. Her planned route was ambitious, but well within her capabilities. A 55-mile loop through the Maroon Bells Wilderness area, one of Colorado's most spectacular and challenging hiking destinations. The trail would take her through alpine meadows, over mountain passes above 12,000 feet, and past pristine lakes that few people ever had the privilege to see. It was exactly the kind of challenging, beautiful adventure that reminded Sarah why she had fallen in love with wilderness backpacking in the first place. That morning, Sarah followed her pre-trip routine with the methodical precision that had kept her safe and healthy during hundreds of outdoor adventures. Her medical preparation was extensive and redundant. She packed her insulin in 3 separate insulated containers with ice packs designed to keep the medication stable for up to 7 days in wilderness conditions. Her primary supply consisted of enough rapid-acting and long-acting insulin for 7 days. Her backup supply contained an additional 5 days' worth, and her emergency reserve held enough insulin for 3 more days, enough medication for 15 days total for a 5-day trip.
Sarah's diabetes management system was sophisticated and proven. She carried a continuous glucose monitor that would alert her to dangerous blood sugar fluctuations, a backup blood glucose meter with plenty of test strips, emergency glucose tablets for treating low blood sugar episodes, and a glucagon emergency kit in case she became unconscious from severe hypoglycemia. Her food planning was also meticulous, with carefully calculated carbohydrate counts for every meal and snack, plus emergency high-carbohydrate foods for treating low blood sugar. Her wilderness gear was top quality and comprehensive. A lightweight backpacking tent rated for mountain conditions, a sleeping bag designed for temperatures down to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, a reliable water filtration system, a GPS device with emergency beacon capability, comprehensive first aid supplies that reflected her medical training, and enough food for 6 days instead of 5. Sarah never took chances with her safety, especially when diabetes added an extra layer of complexity to wilderness travel. At 6 a.m., Sarah sent a detailed text message to her hiking partner and fellow physician, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, who had to cancel at the last minute due to a family emergency. Starting the Maroon Bells loop as planned, GPS coordinates attached, detailed itinerary in your email. Check-in calls scheduled for every evening at 7 p.m. If you don't hear from me by tomorrow night, start the cavalry. Love you, wish you were here. Sarah also filed a detailed backcountry permit with the Forest Service, showing her planned campsites, route, and expected return date. Her emergency contact information included Dr. Rodriguez, her parents in California, and her endocrinologist, Dr. Patricia Williams, who understood both her diabetes management protocols and her passion for wilderness adventures. What Sarah didn't know, what no amount of planning could have predicted, was that 30 miles into her hike, a simple equipment failure would trigger a cascade of events that would test every ounce of her medical knowledge, wilderness skills, and determination to survive. At 7:30 a.m., Sarah shouldered her 45-pound pack and began hiking from the Maroon Lake trailhead, surrounded by some of the most spectacular mountain scenery in North America. The iconic Maroon Bells peaks rose dramatically above her, their red sandstone faces glowing in the early morning light. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine trees and the promise of an incredible adventure. For the first 2 days, everything went according to plan. Sarah maintained excellent blood sugar control, covering 15 miles per day while enjoying some of the most beautiful wilderness she had ever experienced. Her insulin remained properly refrigerated in its insulated containers, her continuous glucose monitor showed stable readings, and her energy levels were perfect for the challenging terrain she was covering. On Saturday evening, camped beside a pristine alpine lake at 11,200 feet elevation, Sarah checked in with Dr. Rodriguez via satellite phone. Day 2 complete, feeling fantastic. Blood sugars perfect, weather beautiful, scenery incredible. This is exactly what I needed after that brutal month in the ER. Talk to you tomorrow night. It was the last normal conversation Sarah would have for the next 48 hours.
Sunday morning, August 19th, 2023, started with the same perfect mountain weather that had blessed Sarah's entire trip. At 6 a.m., she performed her usual morning routine, checking her continuous glucose monitor, readings normal, testing her blood sugar with her backup meter, 102 milligrams per deciliter, perfect, and preparing her morning insulin doses. It was during this routine morning medication preparation that Sarah's carefully planned world began to unravel in the most catastrophic way possible. Sarah kept her primary insulin supply in a specialized diabetic cooling case that used evaporative cooling technology to maintain proper medication temperatures without electricity. The case had worked flawlessly for 2 days, but as Sarah opened it that morning, She immediately knew something was terribly wrong. The cooling case had malfunctioned during the night. Instead of maintaining the required temperature of 36 to 46 degrees Fahrenheit, the internal temperature had risen to over 80 degrees, completely destroying her insulin's effectiveness. The insulin, which should have been crystal clear, was now cloudy and clumpy, visible signs that the protein structure had been denatured by heat exposure, rendering it useless. Sarah's heart rate spiked as she checked her backup insulin supply, stored in a separate cooling case. The backup system had failed as well, victim of the same design flaw that had destroyed her primary medication. 17 years of living with diabetes had taught Sarah to recognize the signs of ruined insulin instantly, and there was no doubt both her primary and backup supplies were completely destroyed. With shaking hands, Sarah checked her emergency insulin reserve, a small supply she kept in her first aid kit as a final backup. This insulin had been stored without refrigeration, relying on manufacturer claims that unopened insulin could remain stable at room temperature for limited periods. But after 2 days of mountain temperature fluctuations, this emergency supply was also showing signs of degradation. At 6:15 a.m., Dr. Sarah Chen, emergency room physician and experienced wilderness adventurer, faced the most terrifying diagnosis of her medical career. She was 30 miles from the nearest road, with approximately 12 hours worth of questionable insulin remaining, and type 1 diabetes that would kill her without medication. Sarah forced herself to think like a physician rather than a panicked patient. She immediately calculated her options and timeline with clinical precision. Without insulin, her body would begin producing ketones as it metabolized fat for energy, leading to diabetic ketoacidosis, a potentially fatal condition that could progress from mild symptoms to coma and death within 24 to 48 hours. Her current blood sugar was normal, but that would change rapidly. Her last long-acting insulin dose had been administered the previous evening and would be losing effectiveness throughout the day. Without replacement insulin, her blood glucose would begin rising within hours, and ketone production would begin shortly afterward. Sarah had 3 options, none of them good. She could attempt to hike out immediately, covering 30 miles of challenging mountain terrain in hopes of reaching medical care before ketoacidosis became life-threatening. She could activate her emergency beacon and hope for helicopter rescue, though weather conditions could delay rescue for days. Or she could attempt to ration her remaining questionable insulin while hiking toward civilization, a strategy that might extend her timeline, but could also lead to dangerous blood sugar swings. At 6:30 a.m., Dr. Sarah Chen, emergency room physician and experienced wilderness adventurer, faced the most important decision of her medical career. She was 30 miles from the nearest road with less than 12 hours of remaining insulin and type 1 diabetes that would kill her without medication. Sarah forced herself to think like a physician rather than a panicked patient. She immediately calculated her options and timeline with clinical precision. Hiking out immediately offered the best chance of survival, but it would push her body to the absolute limits. With no time to waste, Sarah quickly reorganized her pack,
abandoning all non-essential gear to reduce weight and increase her hiking speed. She kept her shelter, minimal food, water purification, first aid supplies, glucose monitoring equipment, emergency beacon, and the small amount of degraded insulin that might buy her a few extra hours of life. At 7 a.m., Sarah began what she knew might be the most important hike of her life, a race against her own body's biochemistry, with death as the penalty for losing.
By 8 a.m., 1 hour into her emergency evacuation hike, Sarah had covered 3 miles of challenging mountain terrain and was maintaining a pace that would normally be considered aggressive even for a healthy hiker. But normal had ceased to exist the moment her insulin supplies failed, and Sarah was now operating under the harsh mathematics of survival. 30 miles to safety, and a body that was slowly beginning to poison itself. Sarah's medical training gave her both an advantage and a curse in her current situation. She understood exactly what was happening to her body at the cellular level, could predict the progression of symptoms she would experience, and knew precisely how much time she had before her condition became life-threatening. But this knowledge also meant she couldn't hide from the terrifying reality that she was in a race she might not be able to win. At 9 a.m., Sarah administered what she hoped would be her last dose of the degraded emergency insulin, a calculated risk that might provide a few hours of blood sugar control or might be completely ineffective. Her continuous glucose monitor was showing the first signs of trouble. Her blood sugar, which had been a perfect 102 milligrams per deciliter 2 hours earlier, had risen to 145 milligrams per deciliter and was climbing steadily. For most people, a blood sugar of 145 would be barely noticeable. For Sarah, it represented the beginning of a biochemical cascade that could kill her. Without effective insulin to help her cells absorb glucose from her bloodstream, that glucose would continue accumulating while her body began breaking down fat and muscle tissue for energy, producing acidic ketones that would gradually poison her blood. Sarah forced herself to maintain a steady hiking pace while monitoring her body for the early signs of ketosis. The first symptoms would be subtle: increased thirst, more frequent urination, and a slight feeling of nausea. These would be followed by more serious signs: abdominal pain, difficulty breathing, confusion, and eventually unconsciousness and death. At 10 a.m., 3 hours into her emergency hike, Sarah reached the first major landmark on her route to safety, Buckeye Pass, a 12,462-foot mountain pass that normally would have been a celebrated achievement. Instead, Sarah barely paused to check her GPS coordinates before beginning the steep descent on the other side. She had covered 8 miles in 3 hours, an impressive pace considering the challenging terrain and her deteriorating medical condition. But her body was beginning to show the strain. Sarah's continuous glucose monitor was now reading 180 milligrams per deciliter and rising, and she was experiencing the first unmistakable symptoms of ketosis: persistent thirst that no amount of water could satisfy, and a subtle but growing feeling of nausea that made eating difficult. Sarah forced herself to consume calories despite the nausea, knowing that she needed energy for the long hike ahead. She chose foods with rapid-acting carbohydrates that would be quickly absorbed, but without insulin to help process those carbohydrates, each meal was also contributing to her rising blood sugar levels. It was a cruel irony. She needed food for energy, but food without insulin was slowly poisoning her. At 11:30 a.m., Sarah reached what would prove to be the most critical decision point of her entire ordeal. The trail offered 2 route options: the standard hiking trail that added several miles but was relatively gentle, or a more direct route that cut through challenging off-trail terrain but would save approximately 5 miles of distance. Under normal circumstances, Sarah would have chosen the safer, longer route without hesitation.
But these weren't normal circumstances. Her blood sugar was now 210 milligrams per deciliter and climbing rapidly, and she was beginning to experience more serious symptoms: moderate abdominal pain, slightly labored breathing, and a metallic taste in her mouth that she recognized as an early sign of ketoacidosis. Sarah chose the direct route, abandoning the established trail to bushwhack through dense forest and steep terrain that would challenge even a healthy hiker. It was a decision that reflected both her desperation and her realistic assessment of her deteriorating timeline. At 1 p.m., 6 hours into her race for survival, Sarah had covered 15 miles, exactly halfway to safety. But her condition was worsening rapidly. Her blood sugar had reached 240 milligrams per deciliter, well into the danger zone, and she was now experiencing moderate diabetic ketoacidosis symptoms, persistent nausea, vomiting that made it difficult to keep food and water down, increasing abdominal pain, and noticeable difficulty breathing. Most concerning, Sarah was beginning to experience cognitive symptoms: difficulty concentrating, mild confusion, and occasional disorientation that made navigation challenging. She was still capable of making decisions and following her GPS, but she could feel her mental clarity slipping away degree by degree. Sarah stopped for 10 minutes to rest and reassess her situation. According to her GPS, she was still 15 miles from the nearest trailhead where she could potentially find help. Her current pace, slowed by increasingly difficult terrain and her worsening condition, suggested it would take her at least 8 more hours to reach safety, assuming she could maintain her current speed as her symptoms worsened. The mathematics were becoming grim. Sarah's medical knowledge told her that with blood sugar levels above 240 milligrams per deciliter and climbing, she was likely producing significant ketones. Without treatment, her condition would continue deteriorating. She might have 12 hours before she became too confused to navigate, and perhaps 18 hours before she lost consciousness entirely. She had to cover 15 miles in less time than her body could survive without medical intervention. At 1:15 p.m., Sarah made a decision that reflected both her medical training and her determination to survive. She would push her body beyond its normal limits, hiking faster and longer than advisable, in hopes of reaching help before ketoacidosis robbed her of the ability to save herself.
By 3 p.m., 8 hours into her emergency evacuation, Sarah had covered 20 miles and was beginning to experience the most frightening aspect of her ordeal. Her body was becoming her enemy. The symptoms of diabetic ketoacidosis were progressing exactly as her medical training had taught her they would. But experiencing them personally while alone in the wilderness was terrifying in ways that textbooks couldn't convey. Sarah's blood sugar had reached 280 milligrams per deciliter, and she was now in moderate to severe ketoacidosis. The nausea had progressed to frequent vomiting that made it nearly impossible to keep food or water down, creating a dangerous cycle where she needed calories for energy but couldn't tolerate eating. Her breathing had become noticeably labored as her body tried to compensate for increasing blood acidity by exhaling excess carbon dioxide. Most concerning was the cognitive impact. Sarah found herself stopping frequently to check her GPS because she was having difficulty remembering which direction she was supposed to be hiking. Simple navigation decisions that should have been automatic were requiring conscious effort and concentration. She was still capable of rational thought, but she could feel her mental capacity diminishing hour by hour. At 3:30 p.m., Sarah experienced her first moment of serious disorientation. She found herself standing in the middle of a meadow
with no memory of how she had gotten there or which direction she had been hiking. For several terrifying minutes, she couldn't remember where she was or what she was doing. Only the persistent beeping of her continuous glucose monitor, alerting her to dangerously high blood sugar, reminded her of her situation. Sarah forced herself to sit down and methodically review her circumstances. She was Dr. Sarah Chen. She had type 1 diabetes. Her insulin had been destroyed. She was hiking out to save her life, and she was currently 20 miles from the trailhead, with 10 miles remaining. The exercise helped restore her mental clarity, but it also drove home how precarious her cognitive state was becoming. At 4 p.m., 9 hours into her hike, Sarah faced her most serious crisis yet. While crossing a steep section of loose rock, her combination of fatigue, dehydration, and cognitive impairment caused her to lose her footing. She fell approximately 8 feet, landing hard on her left shoulder and striking her head against a boulder. For several minutes, Sarah lay motionless at the bottom of the rock slide, confused and disoriented. When she finally regained her senses, she discovered that her left shoulder was injured, probably not broken, but definitely strained and painful. More seriously, the fall had damaged her GPS device, and her continuous glucose monitor had been torn off her arm. Sarah was now 10 miles from safety, with worsening ketoacidosis, an injured shoulder, no GPS navigation, and no way to monitor her blood sugar levels. She only had her backup blood glucose meter, which required painful finger sticks and precious test strips that she needed to conserve. At 4:30 p.m., using one of her remaining test strips, Sarah checked her blood sugar, 320 milligrams per deciliter. She was now in severe ketoacidosis, with blood sugar levels that would typically require immediate emergency room treatment. Her body was producing massive amounts of ketones, making her blood dangerously acidic and affecting every organ system. Sarah's symptoms were now severe and life-threatening. The vomiting was constant, making it impossible to keep down even small sips of water. Her breathing was rapid and deep as her body desperately tried to maintain blood chemistry balance. The abdominal pain was intense, and her heart was racing from dehydration and the stress of ketoacidosis. Most frightening was the mental confusion. Sarah was having difficulty forming coherent thoughts, and her memory was becoming unreliable. She would start hiking in one direction, then stop and wonder if she was going the right way. Simple navigation decisions like which trail to follow required enormous concentration. She was still capable of rational thought, but she could feel her mental capacity diminishing hour by hour. At 5 p.m., Sarah made a decision that probably saved her life. She activated her emergency beacon. The device would alert search and rescue teams to her location, but in the remote wilderness where she was hiking, rescue could take many hours or even days, depending on weather conditions and helicopter availability. Sarah realized that activating the beacon didn't mean she could stop hiking. She was still 10 miles from the nearest road, and with her rapidly worsening condition, she might not survive long enough for rescuers to reach her current location. She needed to keep moving, hiking toward safety, while hoping that rescue teams would intercept her before she became too sick to continue. At 5:30 p.m., 10.5 hours into her race for survival, Sarah was functioning on pure determination and medical knowledge. Her blood sugar was likely above 350 milligrams per deciliter, and she was in severe ketoacidosis that would be considered a medical emergency in any hospital setting. But she was still walking, still navigating, and still fighting for her life with every step. Sarah had 8 miles remaining to the trailhead and approximately 12 hours of daylight left. The question was whether her body could survive long enough for her determination to carry her to safety.
As the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks at 6:30 p.m., Sarah faced a crucial decision that would determine whether she survived the next 12 hours. She had covered 22 miles in 11.5 hours, leaving 8 miles between her and the trailhead. Under normal circumstances, 8 miles would represent 3 to 4 hours of hiking, but Sarah's circumstances were anything but normal. Her condition had deteriorated to the point where she was experiencing severe ketoacidosis symptoms that would typically require immediate intensive care treatment. Her blood sugar, based on the symptoms she was experiencing, was likely above 400 milligrams per deciliter, a level that could cause coma or death. The constant vomiting had left her severely dehydrated. Her breathing was labored and rapid, and her mental confusion was becoming more frequent and severe. Sarah had 2 options. She could attempt to set up her emergency shelter and wait for rescue, hoping that search teams would reach her before ketoacidosis became fatal. Or she could continue hiking through the night, pushing her failing body to cover the remaining 8 miles in darkness while fighting increasing confusion and physical collapse. At 7 p.m., Sarah made the decision that reflected both her medical understanding and her determination to control her own fate. She would hike through the night. Her medical training told her that in her current condition, lying still and waiting for rescue was essentially waiting to die. Her only chance was to keep moving, to use her remaining strength and consciousness to get as close to help as possible before her body shut down completely. Sarah activated the light on her remaining functional device, her backup headlamp, and began hiking in darkness for what she knew might be the last 8 miles of her life. The first few hours of night hiking were a surreal experience of fighting through increasingly severe symptoms while navigating challenging terrain in darkness. Sarah's mental state was deteriorating rapidly. She found herself hiking in the wrong direction multiple times, saved only by forcing herself to stop every 30 minutes to check her position using basic navigation techniques. At 9 p.m., 13 hours into her evacuation, Sarah experienced her first episode of severe disorientation that lasted more than a few minutes. She found herself sitting on a rock beside the trail with no memory of the past hour. Her headlamp was turned off, and she had no idea how long she had been sitting there or what direction she had been hiking. The episode was terrifying because it demonstrated how close she was to complete cognitive collapse. Sarah realized that she was probably experiencing the early stages of diabetic coma and that she might have only a few hours of consciousness remaining. At 10 p.m., 13 hours into her navigation, Sarah experienced her first episode of severe disorientation that lasted more than a few minutes. She found herself sitting on a rock beside the trail with no memory of the past hour. Her headlamp was turned off, and she had no idea how long she had been sitting there or what direction she had been hiking. The episode was terrifying because it demonstrated how close she was to complete cognitive collapse. Sarah realized that she was probably experiencing the early stages of diabetic coma and that she might have only a few hours of consciousness remaining. At 10 p.m., 13 hours into her evacuation, Sarah heard the most beautiful sound she had experienced in her entire life, the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoing through the mountain valleys. Search and rescue teams had received her emergency beacon signal and were beginning aerial searches of her last known location. Sarah immediately began using her emergency whistle and the strobe function on her headlamp to signal the aircraft, but the helicopter was still several miles away and didn't appear to see her signals. The sound of the rotors faded as the aircraft moved to other search areas, leaving Sarah alone in the darkness with the knowledge that rescue teams were looking for her but hadn't found her yet in the vast wilderness where she was hiking. At 11 p.m., 14 hours into her ordeal, Sarah was covering ground more slowly but still moving steadily toward the trailhead. According to her calculations, she had approximately 4 miles remaining, perhaps 2 to 3 hours of hiking if she could maintain her current pace. But Sarah's body was beginning to shut down in ways that made continued hiking increasingly difficult. The dehydration from constant vomiting was causing muscle cramps and weakness. Her heart was racing from the combination of ketoacidosis and dehydration, causing chest pain and shortness of breath that made climbing even small hills exhausting. Most concerning was her mental state. Sarah was experiencing frequent periods of confusion where she would forget where she was or what she was doing. During these episodes, she would find herself standing motionless on the trail, sometimes for several minutes, before remembering that she needed to keep hiking to save her life. At midnight, exactly 18 hours after her medical emergency began, Sarah reached what would prove to be the turning point of her entire ordeal. Cresting a small ridge, she saw lights in the valley below. Not the natural lights of stars or moon, but the artificial lights of human civilization. She could see the glow of the trailhead parking area where her car was waiting, approximately 2 miles ahead. The sight of those lights gave Sarah a surge of hope and determination that carried her through what would be the most difficult 2 miles of her life. She was so close to safety that she could literally see her destination. But her body was failing rapidly, and every step was becoming a monumental effort. At 1 a.m., 20 hours into her medical emergency, Sarah experienced her most serious medical crisis of the entire ordeal. While crossing a small stream, she suddenly collapsed, falling face first into the shallow water. For several terrifying minutes, she was unable to get up, her body racked by severe abdominal pain and uncontrollable vomiting. Sarah realized she was experiencing the late stages of diabetic ketoacidosis and that she was very close to losing consciousness permanently. But the shock of the cold water helped restore some mental clarity, and she managed to pull herself out of the stream and continue hiking. At 2 a.m., 20 hours after her medical emergency began, Sarah could see individual vehicles in the trailhead parking lot. She was less than 1 mile from safety, but each step was requiring enormous effort. Her legs felt like they weighed hundreds of pounds, her vision was becoming blurry, and she was experiencing episodes of confusion that lasted longer and occurred more frequently. Sarah began to worry that she would collapse within sight of safety, that rescue teams would find her unconscious just minutes away from the medical care that could save her life.
At 2:47 a.m. on Monday, August 21, 2023, exactly 20 hours and 47 minutes after discovering her destroyed insulin supply, Dr. Sarah Chen stumbled into the Maroon Lake Trailhead parking lot and collapsed beside her own vehicle. She had covered 30 miles of challenging mountain wilderness, while experiencing severe diabetic ketoacidosis, completing one of the most remarkable self-rescue operations in the history of wilderness medicine. Sarah's arrival at the trailhead was witnessed by a Forest Service ranger who had been coordinating the search and rescue operation from the command post established in the parking lot. Ranger Michael Torres immediately recognized that Sarah was in severe medical distress and radioed for the emergency medical team that had been standing by throughout the night. "This is Torres at the Maroon Lake command post. We have our missing hiker. She's conscious but in severe medical distress. I need the paramedic team here immediately," Torres radioed as he knelt beside Sarah, who was conscious but barely coherent. The first person to provide medical care was paramedic Jennifer Walsh, who had been part of the search team throughout the night. Walsh immediately recognized the signs of severe diabetic ketoacidosis, rapid deep breathing, severe dehydration, altered mental status, and the distinctive fruity odor of ketones that indicated Sarah's body was essentially poisoning itself. "Sarah, I'm Jennifer. I'm a paramedic. You're safe now. We're going to take care of you," Walsh said as she began immediate emergency treatment. "Can you tell me when you last had insulin?" "Yesterday morning," Sarah managed to whisper, her voice hoarse from dehydration and vomiting. "Insulin destroyed. Been hiking 20 hours. Walsh immediately started an IV to begin aggressive fluid replacement and called for emergency transport to the nearest hospital with intensive care capabilities. Sarah's blood sugar, measured with the paramedics' equipment, was 487 milligrams per deciliter, a level that was potentially fatal and required immediate emergency intervention. But what amazed Walsh and the other medical professionals was that Sarah had remained conscious and continued hiking with blood sugar levels that would have incapacitated most people. In 15 years as a paramedic, I've never seen anyone function with blood sugar that high. The fact that she hiked 30 miles while in ketoacidosis is medically remarkable. Dr. Patricia Williams, Sarah's endocrinologist, who had been consulted by phone throughout the rescue operation, explained the medical significance of Sarah's survival. Diabetic ketoacidosis with blood sugar levels above 400 milligrams per deciliter has a significant mortality rate even with immediate medical treatment. The fact that Sarah maintained enough cognitive function to navigate 30 miles of wilderness terrain demonstrates extraordinary determination and the value of understanding your own medical condition. The helicopter transport to Denver General Hospital took 25 minutes, during which the flight medical team worked to stabilize Sarah's blood chemistry and reverse the ketoacidosis that had nearly killed her. Sarah remained conscious throughout the flight, though she was confused and disoriented from the metabolic crisis her body had endured. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, Sarah's hiking partner and fellow physician, was waiting at the hospital when the helicopter arrived. When I saw Sarah being wheeled into the emergency department, I couldn't believe she was conscious. I knew how serious her situation was from the medical reports, and I honestly wasn't sure we would see her alive again. The treatment in the emergency department was intensive and complex, requiring careful management of Sarah's blood sugar, hydration status, and blood chemistry. Dr. Amanda Foster, the emergency physician who treated Sarah, described her condition as one of the most severe cases of diabetic ketoacidosis I've seen in a patient who was still conscious and able to communicate. Recovery took 4 days in the intensive care unit, as Sarah's medical team carefully restored her blood chemistry to normal levels and monitored for complications from the severe ketoacidosis she had endured. But Sarah's medical knowledge and physical fitness had helped her survive an ordeal that could have been fatal for someone less prepared. On Thursday, August 24th,
exactly 1 week after she had started her hiking trip, Sarah walked out of Denver General Hospital under her own power. Her first stop was the medical equipment store, where she purchased a new, more reliable insulin cooling system with multiple backup options. "The most important thing I learned," Sarah told the Wilderness Medicine Conference where she later spoke about her experience, "is that medical knowledge and physical preparation can save your life, but they're only valuable if you combine them with the determination to never give up." There were multiple times during that 20-hour hike when it would have been easier to sit down and wait for rescue, but I knew that in my condition, stopping meant dying. Sarah's story became a case study in wilderness medicine programs across the country, demonstrating both the importance of backup medical preparations and the incredible capacity of the human body to function under extreme physiological stress. Her detailed documentation of symptoms and timeline provided valuable data for treating other diabetic emergencies. 6 months later, Sarah returned to wilderness backpacking, but with enhanced safety protocols and improved backup systems for her medical needs. She also began volunteering with wilderness rescue organizations, using her unique combination of emergency medicine expertise and survival experience to help train other rescue workers. That 20-hour hike taught me that the human body and mind are capable of far more than we think possible. But it also taught me that preparation and knowledge are only valuable if you never stop fighting to save yourself.
This story, like all the stories we share on Hold On Survival Stories, demonstrates that survival sometimes means fighting against your own body when it becomes your greatest enemy. Dr. Sarah Chen's 48-hour battle against diabetic ketoacidosis shows us how medical knowledge can become a life-saving tool, but only when combined with physical preparation and the absolute refusal to surrender when death seems inevitable. The heroes of this story include not just Sarah herself, but the search and rescue teams who worked through the night to find her, the paramedics who provided immediate life-saving treatment, and the medical team who helped her recover from one of the most severe cases of wilderness ketoacidosis ever documented. But perhaps most importantly, this story shows us the power of understanding our own bodies and medical conditions well enough to make life-saving decisions under extreme stress. Sarah's story teaches us that medical conditions don't have to limit our dreams, but they do require extra preparation, backup plans, and the knowledge to recognize when those plans fail. Her endocrinology training helped her understand exactly what was happening to her body and how much time she had to reach safety. But it was her determination to keep hiking despite severe symptoms that ultimately saved her life. Most importantly, Sarah's story shows us that even when our own bodies are working against us, even when every step is a battle against chemistry and biology, there's always reason to hold on. There are always people searching for us, always medical treatments that can reverse even severe conditions, and always hope for recovery if we can just survive long enough to reach help. But before we go, I want to ask you guys some important questions. Do you have medical conditions that require special preparation for outdoor activities? If you were facing a life-threatening medical emergency in the wilderness, would you have the knowledge needed to recognize the symptoms and make survival decisions? And here's a crucial one. Do you have adequate backup plans for your essential medications and medical equipment? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you have medical conditions like diabetes, share your own preparation strategies that help keep you safe during outdoor adventures. Your experience might help someone else who faces their own medical emergency in a survival situation. If this story inspired you, or taught you something about the importance of medical preparedness and never giving up, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Your support helps us bring you more incredible survival stories every week and helps us honor the courage of people like Sarah who refuse to let medical challenges define their limits. Thank you for listening to Hold On Survival Stories. Stay safe, stay prepared, and remember, you're stronger than you know, and knowledge really can be the difference between life and death.